about the time and how you ended up going into the FBI office. What spurred you on?
So at that time, we had just, within a few years, gone through the sort of peak of the civil rights movement, and many of the laws, like the Voting Rights Act, had been passed some years before, but the reality of racial justice was still far from complete. There were, the war in Vietnam was raging at that point in time, and so there were many, many people who were working for change in those areas in particular. My main focus at that time was the anti-war movement. I was, spending as much time as I could with organizing against the war, but I had become very frustrated with legal protest. Didn't seem to be getting us anywhere. The government wasn't listening. The war was escalating and not de-escalating. And I think what really pushed me over the edge was shortly after the invasion of Cambodia, there were 4 students killed at Kent State and 2 more killed at Jackson State. And I'm sorry, I didn't think I'd have this down after all these years. And that really pushed me over the edge, that it was time to do more than just protest, than just march with a sign. And I joined the so-called Catholic Left, which is where I met John and Bonnie, and also Bill Davenon. And from there, the next step was the media action.
Keith, could you also talk about how you were invited to join this plan to break in by William Davenon?
If memory serves, he called me on the phone and asked...
Explain who William Davenon was.
Oh, I'm sorry. Bill Davenon at that time was a professor of physics at Haverford College, and I knew him mainly as a fellow activist in the peace movement. He was very prominent in Philadelphia, in both the legal and the illegal peace movements. And he called me on the phone one day and asked me if I wanted to come to a party, which was code for an action. And I believe I said, sure, I'm always up for a party. You can check the FBI transcript, because they were tapping his phone at the time. And so we met at an outdoor location where we couldn't be bugged, and he presented the idea to me then.
And Bonnie Raines, talk about your involvement. What motivated you? You were a young mother of 3. How old were your children?
They were 8, 6, and 2 at that time. We've since had a 4th child. I became involved, as Keith said, beginning with the civil rights movement, and when we lived in New York and were students. Then we moved to Philadelphia, very much opposed to the war in Vietnam, and found a whole community of activists in Philadelphia. We became acquainted with the what was called the Catholic Left at that time, and the Berrigan brothers, Phil and Dan, were the leaders in that. And we participated with that group called the East Coast Conspiracy to Save Lives in a draft board raid. We went into a draft board in the middle of the night as part of the draft resistance movement.
Where was that? In
North Philadelphia, a draft board in North Philadelphia. We targeted that draft board because it was in one of the poorest sections of the city, where they were bringing many poor young men into the armed forces to be sent as cannon fodder to Vietnam. Our government was lying to us about the casualties, both civilian and military casualties. So I participated, along with John, in going into a draft board and removing files and destroying those files so those young men could not be drafted.
And you mentioned the Berrigan brothers, the
Yes,
priests,
yes.
Phil, the late Phil Berrigan, and Father Dan Berrigan,
Yes.
who's still alive. Catonsville, how significant in 1969 was this for you? I wanted to go to a clip right now of the Catonsville action. That was Catonsville, Maryland, where a group of activists led by Fathers Dan and Phil Berrigan burned draft cards with napalm. They stole hundreds of draft records and torched them. They were sentenced to 3 years in prison, their action helping ignite a wave of direct actions against the draft in the Vietnam War.
We do not believe that nonviolence is dead, and that we don't believe in either posing one form of violence for another, and that we believe that an action like this will still speak to our fellow Americans and bring home to them that a decent society is still possible, but it's totally impossible if these files and what they represent are preserved and honored and even defended as those poor women tried to.
That was Father Dan Berrigan as they stood around in a circle and burned with napalm being used in Vietnam, draft records.
That was a very dramatic moment for all of us, I believe. It took civil disobedience to another level and really brought us clearly to another level of protest against the war in Vietnam. And we followed their lead in targeting the draft as one of the real evil systems of that war. And that's how we became involved in covert actions with draft boards in Philadelphia.
And John Rains, can you talk about your sense that the anti-war movement itself had been infiltrated by FBI informants?
Oh, sure. I mean, that was obvious for any of us who were involved in the civil rights movement, because it happened in the civil rights movement. J. Edgar Hoover's FBI was all over the civil rights movement with infiltrators and surveillance, intense surveillance, and people that would report back on meetings and so on. And of course, we all know that J. Edgar Hoover and his FBI went after Martin Luther King, tried to discredit him, indeed even sent him a note suggesting that because of his activities with other women besides his wife, he now had no option but to commit suicide. That note was sent to Dr. King suggesting, and it was from the FBI, suggesting that Dr. King commit suicide. So that we knew from the Civil Rights actions that J. Edgar Hoover and his FBI were very much against anything that promised significant social change. We brought that information, that knowledge, north with us when we came to the anti-war movement, and it became clear that the tactics he used to disrupt and try to destroy the protest movement in the South, he was using once again against the protesters against the war in Vietnam. The problem was J. Edgar Hoover was untouchable. He was a national icon. I mean, he had presidents who were afraid of him. The people that we had elected to oversee J. Edgar Hoover's FBI were either enamored of him or terrified of him. Nobody was holding him accountable. And that meant that somebody had to get objective evidence of what his FBI was doing. And that led us to the idea that Bill Davidon suggested to us. Let's break into an FBI office, get their files, and get what they're doing in their own handwriting.
You and Bill Davidon were professors.
Yeah.
He a professor at Haverford, you a professor at Temple University. Yeah. What did you feel about the risk that you were taking? Were you concerned about getting caught?
Well, Bonnie and I were parents, and we had 3 kids under 10, and that was a very serious consideration. We had to be persuaded that we could get away with this. And we learned nice burglar skills from priests and nuns. Yes, true. And we'd cased the FBI office and media very carefully.
You thought about Philadelphia, but thought it was too secure?
Oh, yes. It was a big building downtown. You couldn't touch that. But media, you could. And we felt quite confident that if we could get in there and get out without leaving any physical evidence behind, that we could then disappear into the very, very large anti-war movement, thousands of people in the Philadelphia area.
You had prepared in case you were caught to have your children taken care of.
We knew the risks. We knew the jeopardy. We weren't going to be reckless. We weren't going to move ahead with our involvement, except with the leadership of Bill Davidan, who we all had so much admiration and respect for. But we did feel that it was necessary to speak to John's older brother and his wife and to my mother and father about caring for our children if should the worst happen and we would be convicted and sent to federal prison.
Keith Forsyth, you chose the night of the Muhammad Ali, Joe Frazier fight to break in. Why? Why was this so significant, March 8th, 1971?
Well, it was just, you know, there were many steps that we took to try to avoid getting caught. And this was one of them, because whoever suggested it, and I have no idea who it was, thought that it would add to the distraction, not only of the police, but of just people in general. The building in which the office was located had a live-in supervisor, and his apartment was directly below the FBI office. So he was going to be on the next floor down while we were inside walking around opening cabinets. So anything that could keep his mind off of the ambient sounds sounded like a good idea.
How did you know that you would find what documents you would find, or did you know?
We didn't know. We were pretty sure. You know, bureaucracies are the same everywhere. They love to keep records. But we were taking a shot. So in that sense, we got lucky that they did keep records.
This brings Betty Metzger into the story, whose book this week, The Burglary, reveals the identities of the activists involved in this burglary. Looks like J. Edgar Hoover found his match in this group of people. Talk about receiving in the mail the documents. You're a reporter at the time for the Washington Post.
Okay. I'd just like to say something about Bill Davidan, if I might first, that the idea was Bill's. And Bill participated in preparations for the book and the documentary that's been made in 1971. And we should note that we're all very sorry that Bill's not with us. Bill died in November. But he was sort of a genius in coming up with this idea, because although many people in the various movements at that time thought that there were FBI informers in their organizations, there was no evidence of that, and the public didn't know. And Bill had this deep commitment that if the public could be presented with evidence, they would be very upset, even though Hoover was an iconic figure, that if they knew that there was massive surveillance, of the political surveillance, that they would care and do something, and that's what happened. I was a reporter, and one day this envelope appeared in my mailbox, and it said it was from Liberty Publications. That was the return address, Media, Pennsylvania. That didn't mean anything to me. But when I opened it, there was a cover letter that said it was from the Citizens Commission to investigate the FBI. That was a new organization to me. And the letter explained that a group of 8 people had burglarized an FBI office on the night of March 8th, and that enclosed were some of the files that they had removed from the office. And some of those files were very shocking. I think the one, and you showed the excerpt from this on the retro report, the first shock, and this also resonated very much with the public when it was published and discussed, was the one that instructed agents to enhance the paranoia and then also make people think that there's an FBI agent behind every mailbox. And that was a pretty stunning statement and said so much. And the burglars themselves were shocked, I understand, when they found that, saw that document the first night after the burglary. So that stunned me. And I guess the other files, there were many about individuals, and they were all serious. But one of the things that I remember most from those files was the truly blanket surveillance of African American people that was described. It was in Philadelphia, but it also prescribed national programs. It was quite stunning. First, it described the surveillance. It took place in every place where people would gather: churches, classrooms, stores down the street, just everything. But it also specifically prescribed that every FBI agent was supposed to have an informer just for the purpose of coming back every 2 weeks and talking to them about what they had observed about Black Americans. And in Washington, D.C. at the time, that was 6 informers for every FBI agent informing on Black Americans. The surveillance was so enormous that it led various people, rather sedate people in editorial offices and in Congress, to compare it to the Stasi, the dreaded secret police of East Germany.
Could you talk about how the editors at the Washington Post responded when you showed them these documents?
The editors responded very positively to them. I should point out that 2 things. First, this was the first time that a journalist had ever received secret government documents from a source who had, from the outside, an outside source who had stolen the documents. So that tended to pose a different kind of consideration as to what you would do in their minds, as to what you do with the documents. But it was a particularly tough decision for Katharine Graham, who until this time had never faced anything like this.
The publisher.
The publisher, Katharine Graham, the publisher of the Washington Post, because it was the first time that she had been faced with a demand from the Nixon administration that she suppress a story. And she did not want to publish, and the in-house counsel, the lawyers, also did not want to publish. But 2 editors from the beginnings realized it was a very important story and pushed it, Ben Bradley and Ben Bagdikian. I was just back there innocently writing my story, I'd been a reporter in Philadelphia and was talking to sources from the past, confirming information. Didn't know until 6 o'clock that there was a question as to whether or not they would publish. By 10 o'clock that night, she decided to publish.
And talk about the reaction and the reporters who did not get to publish the story, because you weren't the only person that these activists sent the documents to.
They sent them to 5 people. These are the first files that they released. They sent them to Senator George McGovern and Representative Perrin Mitchell from Baltimore. And they immediately returned the files to the FBI when they received them and didn't make them public. They sent them to 3 journalists, in addition to sending them to me. They sent them to Jack Nelson at the Washington Bureau of the Los Angeles Times.
Great crusading reporter who wrote Terror in the Night about the Klan in the South.
Right. And Tom Wicker, columnist then at the New York Times. Now, it's also important to keep in mind, in addition to the fact that we didn't really know, the public didn't know what was happening inside the FBI, that very few journalists ever wrote investigative work or critical comment about the FBI. And Jack Nelson and Tom Wicker were 2 of about 3 or 4 who had up until that point. At the LA Times, Jack never received the envelope, even though it was addressed to him, and it was delivered to the FBI immediately. I didn't know this until years later when I read the investigative report on the FBI's investigation. It's a little less clear what happened at the Times as to whether Tom Wicker received him. What they did do was same thing. They immediately gave the files to the FBI, but they apparently kept them and copied them, unlike the LA Times, because the day after we broke the story, then they wrote stories on the same files.
Keith, before we go to break, can you talk about parallels to today? It is hard to look at, and for a moment I want to turn to the Church Committee hearings that took place a few years later. Senator Frank Church of Idaho led this investigation. The Senate's Church Committee investigated the CIA and FBI's misuse of power at home and abroad. The multi-year investigation in the mid-'70s followed the exposure of COINTELPRO, which stands for Counterintelligence Program. And it was the first time people had seen that word was in the documents you released. Examining the FBI and CIA's efforts to infiltrate and disrupt leftist organizations, the CIA's attempts to assassinate foreign leaders, and much more. This is Senator Frank Church speaking during one of the committee's hearings.
We have seen today the dark side of those activities, where many Americans who were not even suspected of crime were not only spied upon, but they were harassed, they were discredited, and at times endangered.
That was Senator Frank Church. The Church Committee hearings led to major changes in what the FBI could do, and also dealing with the press as well. You listen to Frank Church, you could be hearing possible hearings today, though they haven't started, to do with Edward Snowden. Right. What are your thoughts on Edward Snowden today?
I think there are some parallels. It's not an exact parallel. But to me, one of the most significant ones is that not long before Edward Snowden released these documents, James Clapper went in front of Congress and the American public and was asked a direct question whether the NSA was engaged in this kind of surveillance, and he said no. Which was obviously a lie. And I think if he had said, oh, we can't talk about that because that's national security, I might have had some respect for that answer. But to come out and lie to the public about it, and of course not suffer any punishment as a result. So to me, Edward Snowden, I've seen no evidence personally that Edward Snowden has released anything that was actually harmful to our national security. Certainly has been embarrassing. But to me, the young man is definitely a whistleblower and has performed a great service by enabling us to have the conversation. We couldn't have the conversation about whether this is right or wrong before because we were not told about it. So he's made that conversation possible, and I think we owe him a debt for that.